never met someone who deserves the day the way that you do. Joseph, it's time to get ready and the spotlight's shining down upon you. Joseph, so be fine, hold firm. I'm on my way, yeah, here it comes. And I'm delivering a wish to you, so get ready, from every peak and valley they're telling you to get ready, 'cause here it comes. It's on the way. It's a celebration across the nation.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is CeeLo Green, and you are now tuned in to Joseph Jaffe is Not Famous. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. He is not famous at all. Check out this new streaming show. It is perfect. And if you don't, fuck you.
I'm overconfident. Am I becoming complacent about complacency?
I think you are.
Oh, he's not the Messiah, he's just a very naughty boy.
Yeah, for big ears.
Brian doesn't want to see anyone else. Piss off!
That's the one, because you literally complete me, and we complete each other.
You've obviously encountered discrimination in your own life by virtue of being Australian.
Hey, Manuel Kant was a real pissant who was very rarely stable.
I don't want to get too gushy, but I might just be saying you complete me, Dean. PNG now stands for Pritchard and Good.
Branding is not a bad blind date. Look at you! You are insane!
How did I do that?
You're
How
insane!
did I do that?
You're insane!
Happy Thursday, everybody. It is Thursday. It is January 13th, 2022. And we are celebrating. We are celebrating good times. We are celebrating being alive and kicking, or kicking and screaming. Whatever works for you works for me. So welcome to Joseph Jaffe is Not Famous, but my next guest, of course, is Lubna is here. Lubna, welcome. I think you might want to be looking for a little QR code, a little bit of alpha code. There is your code, Lubna. I know you're not here for the code. And actually, I've posted the airdrop link in my Discord. More on that soon. But we are here today to celebrate an old friend. I mean, you know, he's not in his mid-60s at all, because, you know, I didn't say this to him in the green room, but I think we can round it down, David. I think we can round it down. You know, I think when it's 4, it rounds down. So there you go. You're only as old as you feel. Brian Piper is here. He said, glad to be here on a Thursday, almost the weekend. Every day is a weekend here at Joseph Jaffe is Not Famous Studios, if you will. David Riemer and I met many years ago in the grand old days of AOL, Yahoo, and MSN. In fact, he was at Yahoo. Yahoo, no doubt, did, without question, I think the best job at being able to create a platform, a place, a space for creativity and for agencies and brands to come together and be able to leverage the real power of digital. Mr. Tom Morris is here. Tom, who is having work done, and yet he took a break from door and window installations to send in his vignette, and we will hear from him shortly as well. Philosopher Thursdays. Tom, welcome back, and I'm so glad the show is now at a time that works for you at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, tomorrow, we start a new section called NFT Fridays. Last year, we were on 4 times. Now we are on 5 times, Monday through Friday, and Fridays are dedicated to NFTs. It's not just to the NFT, it is to the founder, it is to the community, it is to the project, it is to the vision. And tomorrow we will hear from Michelle McCormack. They've just put out an incredible collection called Fierce Models, Fierce NFTs. She has one that looks exactly like her. And I have some alpha for you as well regarding tomorrow, which is we're going to be giving away one of her amazing NFTs. So we will be giving away a Fierce NFT. Right now, the floor on OpenSea is about 0.1 ETH. So I guess that's the equivalent of about $3,300, so about $330. It is exciting to see woman-owned and woman-run and woman-focused projects really starting to demonstrate their clout, their influence, their power as well. And as I said this morning, in a room on Clubhouse, I believe Clubhouse still exists, I think. But I actually said, one of the things, it was actually on parenting. And I turned around and I said, as parents, especially parents of little girls, whether you have a little girl on the way, whether you have an infant, a toddler, or even a young lady, now is the time to create and buy some of these very special projects, buy into these projects, and create a beautiful little basket for them when they're old enough to understand, to appreciate, and be able to benefit from these incredible communities. Glenn is here, and Glenn said, I drove as fast as I could to here. I ain't famous, Joseph Jaffe. You've just gone ahead and rebranded or hijacked my entire show. But Glenn has a Tesla, so I don't know what your problem is. Self-driving cars ultimately will lead the way. So anyway, tune in tomorrow, and you will be able to win an NFT from the new Fierce collection. Not only can you win an NFT, but you can also get some Jaffe coin. All we do on the show is give you things. We give you content. We give you access. We give you community. It's awesome to be able to give and not really expect anything back for the most part in return. So there is your QR code. And of course, if you want to experience the new not famous Discord server, because I'm not famous, my show is not famous, my Discord is not famous, but my guest, sure as hell, is very famous. Just go to bit.ly/not famous Discord, and I will give you just a little bit more alpha. If you want to win that NFT, it's definitely going to help you if you are subscribed to my Discord server and subscribed to the show on YouTube. So spread the word, or don't spread the word, if you want to win that NFT for yourself. But I have a feeling you'll be okay to spread it. Now we get into the seated soliloquy, and the seated soliloquy today is called We Are All Made of Stories. But really, I'm doing something that I did yesterday, which is not to write a script, not to read a script, but in fact to use my handy dandy egg timer and give you 3 minutes of riffing, 3 minutes of thought leadership, 3 minutes from my heart in terms of how I interpret the subject, interpret what my guest is about, interpret the idea of stories and startups. So let's take it away. So certainly we are all made of stories, but why is it important for startups to understand the power of stories? Why is it important for startup founders to be able to be effective storytellers? Now, David Riemer is going to give a professional, he is an expert, he is a subject matter expert, he is an author, and he will talk about his perspective. But I wanted to talk to you about why it connects with me. I do a lot of mentoring, I do a lot of coaching to startups, all pro bono work. And one of the things I always say to founders is, I love it when I understand and when I know your personal connection to the project. Oftentimes, an idea, a concept, a startup, even an NFT project for the most part, it comes out of a personal curiosity, a frustration, even a pain. Pain and pleasure are actually very closely linked or connected. I was a teacher. I was a parent. I couldn't get a car or a cab when I needed one, so I started Uber. Sometimes it really can almost seem as simple or as oversimplified, but it isn't simple at all. There is simplicity, but it isn't oversimplified. And so I love it when people can come to the table with a personal story, because it is context. It makes everything more believable, more authentic, more human as well. And once you understand who the founder is and what they care about, and quite frankly, why they care, then there is a connection that is like made out of Gore-Tex. It is impossible to sever. It is impossible to pull apart. By the way, I forgot to even activate my egg timer, which means activate. In other words, I forgot to turn it around, which means that this could be a minute and a half, or it could be 45 minutes. You could be getting an entire keynote from me. But I actually just want to make one more point today, which is we always hear that investors, VCs, angels, that they don't really invest in products. They don't really invest in technology, in patents, in trademarks, in an app. They invest in people. They invest in people. And when people invest in people, the money, the technology, that's all nice to have. It's not have to have. But I feel that when you are investing in a person, you are investing in their story. You are investing in their ability to be vested in not just the idea, but in the relationship and in where that idea can take them and where it can head. So much and so often, a startup ends up being something completely different to what the founder envisioned it could have been and would have been. And that is a function of them being open to feedback, but it is also a function of recognizing that a story doesn't have to be already cut and carved in stone. The story can be living, breathing, unfolding before our very eyes. So that, my friends, is what I call a seated soliloquy that is spontaneous, a spontaneous seated soliloquy, if you will. Now, I was watching David Riemer in the background, seeing whether he was vehemently disagreeing with that or whether he was in agreement. But we are about to bring him on and find out for himself. Natalie Jaffe, also known as my mother, said, good idea. I'm not sure now at this point whether she thinks the free NFT is a good idea. So, Mom, I hope that you are subscribed to my show, and I hope you are subscribed to my Discord server. Your follow-up question might be, what is a Discord server? But Jackie Stone says she wants to win. So you might just win, Jackie. So we'll see you tomorrow. And Tom Morris said, excellent. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't that excellent because I forgot to turn it around. Let me tell you a little bit about David Riemer in terms of his background. And of course, you know, we have a very personal connection. David helps entrepreneurs and innovators get their stories straight. Early in his career, David was president of the ad agency J. Walter Thompson, and then JWT, and now no more, in San Francisco, held senior marketing roles at 2 tech startups, and was VP of marketing at Yahoo in its heyday. Truth. And to be VP of marketing at Yahoo was, you know, for me there, I mean, what an amazing brand. I'm going to have to ask him about that. Today, teaches storytelling at Berkeley Haas School of Business and several Bay Area accelerators. He is the author of the upcoming book. Is it upcoming or is it out? Get your startup story straight, the definitive storytelling framework for innovators and entrepreneurs. David also co-founded Spiral Staircase Productions and is developing not one, but 2 original musicals. He holds a BA from Brown University and an MBA from Columbia University. I've never heard of those universities, but they sound pretty good. David Riemer, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And the book is out, by the way. It launched a couple of days ago, and it's in the world.
Oh, wow. So it's like, so not only do you need to update your bio, no, that's what I told her, but that's amazing. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
Congratulations. I mean, the book has literally just come out that you haven't even updated it. So that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yep. It's out as of 2 days ago and doing pretty well so far.
How many books is this for you?
This is my first book. This is my
So
first book. I've written musicals
wow.
before, and I've written lots of articles and other things, but this is my first book.
So welcome to the club. You know that there is a secret handshake. There is, you're part of the society. It is a glorious society, although these times are insanely crazy and challenging. I don't know if I don't know if I'll ever write another book. There's just too much stuff going on. I would like to. I have book ideas, but I
Well,
think there's an element of sadness, maybe, but I just don't think I have it in me anymore.
you might have missed your opportunity because the last 2 years was the perfect time to sit down and write a book. And people had been bugging me for about 10 years to write this book, and I finally was like, okay, we have a pandemic, write a book. So that's what I did. And by the way, I want to say how excited I am to be on a show, not only with you, but that starts with conversations about fierce NFTs, um, and CeeLo Green is on it, and starts with Smokey. So what a great way to kick off me talking about my book with you and all those wonderful people and stories.
Exactly, and they are all famous, but unfortunately, I am not. And I do hope and pray that I do become exceptionally more not famous. But we will see what the future holds for us. Now, I'm excited you're here too. You're here too. I will say that what I did do, of course, you know this, is in this 2 year period, I did start a talk show. And here's the interesting thing, by the way. I have archived all of these soliloquies. And not only is there one book, but there are about almost 3 books right now when you actually look at the word count. I didn't realize at the time that writing 400 words a day, it adds up. And each one of these soliloquies not only is tied to and connected to my guest, but also, sign of the times in terms of what was going on in the world at that time. We had elections, we had this little distraction called a pandemic. We had so many of these things. So I look back at, I don't know if I'll ever publish them, but it has been interesting that even though I thought I wasn't writing, in fact I was.
Well, just to share you one other author's journey, the book for me came from a similar kind of experience. I had written a bunch of stories for a bunch of classes that I teach that are asynchronous, right? You film a section of the class, the students view the class virtually, and then we have one synchronous session or 2 synchronous sessions where we actually are together talking about the content. And it was from those collection of stories I'd written for those asynchronous classes that I was like, oh, wait a minute. If I put these together and come up with some structure, maybe it's a book. And lo and behold, it's a book. So you could do the same thing.
I think there's something very interesting there, right? Because I had this conversation actually a while back, which is if you think about storytelling, and we'll get into the main subject in a moment, but if you think about the word, the written word, even the spoken word, everything seems to have been cut down and 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 edited, and we've gone from great novels to tweets, right? I mean, that's the classic example. But even in terms of presenting now, when you're asked to present, it's like, can you give us a TED talk? Can you give us 5 minutes? Can you give us 8 minutes? Whether it's the attention span or whether it's just the fact that it almost feels like a lost art form now. And then you have what you did, which is the ability to take all of those small bites and vignettes, patch them together, and create this beautiful long form tapestry.
Yeah. Although I will say that concision is one of the most important aspects of storytelling. The famous quote, which is attributed to Mark Twain and Pascal and others, I would have written a short letter, but I didn't have the time.
Mm.
It's hard to write the short letter, right? It's easy to write all the long, page after page, but if you're trying to get down to that really short letter, there's a tremendous art to that. What do I leave in? What do I take out? How do I make sure I advance the plot of the story fast enough, but have enough detail so I bring my audience into the story so they feel like they're in the story, which is the power of storytelling, is bringing your audience into the story so they make themselves the protagonist in the story as they're hearing it. A lot of the art of that is finding out what to leave in and what to take out, and being concise is often a goal. Regardless of the setting, right? And yes, there are many settings where we're forced to be. You've got 5 minutes, you've got 2 minutes. A lot of the demo day work that founders do is 5 minutes. And sometimes they only have a couple of minutes really to get the central story across.
I'm just glad that you explained what the word concision meant, but now I know what it is. It is kind of like a contrition, but not. You're very unfair, because I was about to take you in a different direction, and then you drop a little pearl, and I would be remiss if I did not shine that pearl on behalf. And I'm not referring to your head. Is that there is a ridiculous art when it comes to concision, right? If I used it correctly, when it comes to being able to take your life's work and turn it into a 5-minute pitch, a 3-minute pitch, a 1-minute pitch. I do this with Founders Institute. They start off with 1-minute pitches, and then it moves to 3, 5, and eventually 10. And what you realize is it's a lot easier to go from 1 to 10 than it is from 10 to 1. How do you retain the art, the creativity, the emotion, the flesh when you have to cut down to bare bones?
Well, you pick the parts that most resonate with people. You pick the parts that really make people feel something. I had an experience working with a founder who was developing a method and a process for people who are experiencing cancer and navigating through that experience and managing it. And he said at one point, his name is Steve Derrico, he said, for the patient, it's like having a second full-time job. It's like having a full-time job managing cancer. And that just really bowled me over, because I know how hard it is to have one full-time job. So the idea of having 2 full-time jobs just was devastating to me when I heard that. And knowing people who've had to navigate that experience. And I just suggested to Steve, I said, I would always use that notion. It's like having a full-time job, because it instantly people will just feel that, and then you can build more around that. And just landing that one thing, he later told me, and using that in his storytelling was game changing for him, because he could use that as a center point and then build everything around it, and his audience immediately felt this sense of, as you say, pain and pleasure, right? The pain of having to navigate that. So try and land on that one thing, that idea that really makes people feel something, and that's a very fast way of getting a part of the story, getting through a part of the story and on to the next part of the story.
I think it's brilliant, and I mean, it's in that soundbite in of itself, there is a lifetime of priceless insight for so many startups and founders. Because my takeaway from that is, it can be a word, it can be a phrase, it can be an idea, but it is an anchor, and everything, it is a seed, and everything builds around that. I heard yesterday Grant McCracken, he used the phrase cruelty-free capitalism. And I just loved it. Like, I can see your reaction too. You're writing it down. That's what I did as well. And I was like, whoa, like, you can just give me cruelty-free capitalism, and I'm going to get a reaction out of you. Give me 30 seconds, give me 60 seconds, give me 5 minutes, give me an hour. Can you imagine what I can do with that?
Yeah, it's incredible. Just the right language can just be can create that breakthrough. There's a company, I first came across the founders of this company. They came into my office hours. A student at Berkeley, who said she wanted to start a company, a fashion company, and now it's a $100 million company 10 years later. And the real incredible thing about them is they wanted to fight fast fashion. They wanted to take on fast fashion and sort of effectively create slow fashion. And they were doing really well building this company. And they one day in a brainstorm session, they landed on the line, fewer, better things. And fewer, better things became their mantra that just sort of lit up their company, because then everything they did played to that, just that language. And there was so much in it that it basically said, screw fast fashion. This is something completely different. And they make these beautiful classic purses and blouses and skirts and dresses, and accessories. They're all classic things that can last season after season and not have to be thrown out after the 3-month cycle of a fast fashion season is over. But fewer, better things just sort of landed it for them, and everything opened up from there. So even though my book isn't about coming up with taglines, sometimes just the right language can be the kind of thing that sets a story in motion, and it was for them.
I was actually laughing. I was smiling. You know, if I was laughing, I was laughing on the inside. But I was smiling as you said that, because the phrase that resonated with me was slow fashion. And I thought,
Yeah.
like, isn't that interesting how in that same story or in that same insight, I went somewhere else. And, you know, again, yesterday, Grant talking about fast culture and slow culture, I was like, slow fashion. Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. That's interesting. You know,
Yeah,
I
well,
can.
it's a place you can easily go, and then you start thinking about what is slow fashion. You know, the company, by the way, is called Cuyana, Cuyana, really wonderful company, and they're opening up some retail outlets in New York and San Francisco and LA, et cetera. But as they started to explore this, it was very clear in their storytelling that their antagonist was fast fashion. And one of the things that I talk a lot about is creating an antagonist in your story. Who's the enemy? You know, when Salesforce came out, the enemy was software. They literally showed up at Microsoft conferences in 2000, and they had hired actors to walk around with signs that had said software with a big red circle and a red line through the word software. That was the enemy, and they could come in, and their solution was in the cloud. Cuyana positions fast fashion as the enemy, and therefore they are the hero. And I guess slow fashion is one way of articulating who they are in this world of fast fashion. So sometimes creating that antagonist in your story can be incredibly powerful, and then you're sort of on the other side of it. And of course, slow fashion would be that what they are.
It's very funny because also going back to Salesforce is now Salesforce for the most part is the enemy or is an enemy to someone else.
Exactly.
So you can be the hero in one story and the enemy or the villain in another story. That's also interesting. Obviously, you know, I would be remiss marketer to marketer if I didn't give a little shout out to the Jungian, you know, to the wonderful Jungian personas, and understand how well they work in terms of being able to create a beautiful tapestry, a beautiful narrative. But that's great. So the enemy. Let's go back to Yahoo days just for a second. Who was or what was the enemy that Yahoo pushed off against?
Well, I think the enemy at the time was, and if you go all the way back to the beginning, the enemy was just sort of the confusion of the internet and the incredible scale of it. Suddenly, everything was on the internet. And when Jerry and David founded the company, the original story was, "We'll help you find the cool stuff." It's hard, it's complicated. The enemy is trying to find what you're looking for. Remember, when they started the company, it was pre-search. So Jerry and David created directories. I'm interested in recreation. I'm interested in badminton, and you go down these little, you know, these queues, and eventually you get to the thing you were interested in. And so the original premise was, we're going to make it easy to find the cool stuff on the internet, and the enemy was the confusion and the just sort of the overwhelming nature of now everything in the world is available here. And that's sort of how it started. I think that if we had done a better job of positioning ourselves against Google, who ultimately became the big enemy, the company's fortunes might have done a little bit better over time. And if so, we might have focused on discovery versus search. Google was all about search. You'd go to a blank page, you'd have to have something in your head, you type it into that box on a blank page and find what you were looking for. But when you went to Yahoo, it was always something new to discover. because Yahoo had different stories and different sort of human interest stories and stories about sports and finance and all these different things. And it surfaced these stories in the Yahoo homepage. And it was a way to discover things. And as I look back on our storytelling, I wish we'd leaned into that a little bit more back then. I think it might have helped a little bit back in the day.
Well, I think, I think you're being maybe a little bit harsh on yourself because you did such a phenomenal job. I mean, maybe it's interesting. I'm looking at the comments, and Bob Farnham says, so much change in so little time. Amazing. I think sometimes you can't see the change, right? And sometimes what happens is you're so focused on an enemy when another one comes along that you didn't see coming, and how could you?
Yeah.
And so that's interesting. I was thinking also, professor to professor. I'm teaching at NYU and also Western Connecticut State University, and it's interesting when you actually think about the genius of what Google has done. Their homepage, there are three things, right? Their homepage is nothing. It's just a blank space. There is only one logo, and that's theirs. Free impressions every single day at the expense of everyone else. Number one, right? But also they've got this idea of I'm feeling lucky. I'm going to bet that not many people go there and just say, I'm feeling lucky. Take me to a random page on the internet. But what that does do, in a way, is it kind of proves themselves against what Yahoo was or what someone else might want to be, because it's so deliberate, and so left brain. And then they just give out, I'm feeling lucky, which kind of is their like little get out of jail free card with respect to discovery, which it kind of isn't.
Yeah. Well, to me, one of the most fascinating things about Google is not the consumer side, but the business side. Because speaking of stories, they absolutely understood the customer in that story, which was the small business, which was desperate to find the customers most interested in what they made or what they created, what they sold. And once they discovered that there were all these people searching for these very specific things, they started to think, well, gee, wait a minute, I've got all these people with these very specific interests on one side, consumers, and then on the other side, I've got all these businesses trying to reach people with very specific interests. The closest we ever got to it in the past was the Yellow Pages, like way in the past, where if I'm searching for taxi in my Yellow Pages, there might be an ad for a taxi because I know that person is interested in finding a taxi. The Google recognized that this was the same kind of premise, and they really got in the heads of the customer, and they figured out what's the best way to serve that business customer. What's their problem? They can't find these people. How do I help them solve the problem? Well, I'll push people to them that are expressing intent and interest in a general category. That I now have businesses on the other side, and they built this amazing two-sided market, which is a love story. And I like that aspect of the Google story because obviously marketers understand that, but maybe larger people in the world don't see how they really nailed that particular story. And that's why Google became Google, because they reinvented the advertising business and came up with an extraordinarily profitable model that fueled then everything else they did.
I'd love to get into your book, and I think maybe a little bit of context for that is, first of all, there was my Soliloquy, which introduces this idea that investors invest in people, and certainly customers don't necessarily invest in products either. Customers are investing in something else. They're investing in experiences, but you could argue that they're investing in stories, and maybe even investors are investing in stories as well. Then you have this quote, and this is the quote that I found for you today, which is, marketing is no longer about the stuff you make, but the stories you tell. And speaking of small companies or people that no one has ever heard of, perhaps you've heard of the person who said this, a gentleman by the name of Seth Godin. So now you've got these two ideas, right? That marketing is not about the stuff you make, but the stories you tell. Investors and customers aren't investing in product or startups or apps, but the stories that are being told. And that becomes, I guess, a beautiful segue to get your startup story straight. So tell us, set it up for us, and bring it home with Jaffe as Exhibit A, Godin as Exhibit B.
Well, if you think about it, the story of this book is that there are many people who are creating something new. By the way, I call this book Get Your Startup Story Straight because it's alliterative. I like the title, but it's really for anybody creating something new. You don't have to be in a startup. You don't have to be a founder. You could be a product person. You could be someone trying to create something new for your community. It doesn't matter, something new. But all of these people looking to create something new are trying to, figure out, what should I create? What should I build? And how can I make sure it's the best possible thing? A, and B, how do I get people excited about it? And as I've worked with all these folks for the last 15 years or so out in the Bay Area, which is really the heart of global innovation, person after person would say, help me tell the story. And where we would always start is, well, first we have to figure out, what is the story? Who is the best customer for this idea? What is exactly going on in their lives that would lead them to something, some pain point? You talked about pleasure and pain. What's the pain? And can I try and solve that problem? And how do I solve that problem better than someone else? That's the story. And a lot of times in working through that with a customer, a founder, or a product person, they would rethink the story because they hadn't really thought much about the story, or not enough. And so this book is about, first and foremost, making sure you have the right story and a discipline and a framework to help you build the right story. And then once you have the story, it's like, okay, how can I get people really excited about it? How can I get them to feel it? How can I use storytelling to put people into the shoes of the customer and make them feel the pain of the customer so they're rooting for you to solve their problem? And that's what the book is about.
I want to, by the way, and we will hear from him shortly. Tom Morris says, I love the title and the look of the new book. Congratulations, David. It sounds like it's packed with real wisdom.
Well, it's funny. I spent obviously a lot of time thinking about the title. Originally, I was going to call it Startup Story, but I pushed it and went further because ultimately I talk a ton in the book about nailing your value proposition. How can you get your value proposition across succinctly so that people see your value proposition and they're like, oh, I want that. And then you can go learn more about, okay, what is it about the product that lets you get that? Well, the value proposition of my book is the title. Get Your Startup Story Straight is the value proposition of the whole book, and it's the title. And the product descriptor is the subhead. The definitive storytelling framework for innovators and entrepreneurs. That describes what the book is, but what it does for you, the benefit of the book is you can get your startup story straight. And so anyway, that's where the title came from. And it also is an important lesson in the book, which is make sure you're really clear about what someone's going to get out of your product or service. And I chose to put it in the title.
Well, I like that. I mean, I like, first of all, the fact that you are walking the talk, that your book has a story, that there is a story behind the book. If you didn't, there would be something that would almost be disingenuous. There'd be a disconnect. There'd be, well, wait a second. And now this is all about functional. Here are the 5 steps you can take in order to, the startup storytelling for dummies. And that's clearly not what this is. It struck me as you were telling that story that there was a very interesting phrase, which for me is almost a tell. And that is, help me tell the story. And I was almost thinking, when somebody comes to you, and I will ask it in the form of a question, which is, how many times when someone has come to you, when a startup founder has come to you saying, help me tell the story, how many times did they actually not have a story to tell?
The right, fully developed story, never. Right?
That's what I was thinking.
What's so interesting about this exercise is when I work with someone, and the book is designed to do this without me in the room, is to get the founder, the innovator, the product person to get inside the head of the customer. The customer is the protagonist in your story. And as you start to think about your customer as sort of the hero in the story, and they're on this hero's journey, there's something they're struggling with, they need help with. And there's all sorts of stuff going on in their personal life or work life, depending on whether it's a consumer or business product. And as you understand those things, you can really hone in on the exact problem to solve. and then figure out if the thing you're creating is actually solving that thing. And you're also thinking about the competitors and thinking, gee, is it better than all the other ways that they could solve it today? And by going through that process and forcing them to put themselves in the shoes of the customer, even though they've done that to some degree, dig for much deeper insights. I don't just want a functional insight. I want an emotional insight. Dig into what's really going on with a customer. When they go through that process, almost every single time they come out the other side with at least a refined version of where they started. And we have to do that before we can say, okay, now that we have that, let's come up with a really exciting and compelling way to tell it, so you move your audience and they feel something. But that's the second step. The first step is it the right story, and how can we fine tune that story?
Well, I was thinking, my name for your book would have been West Side Startup Story, but that's because right now my kids are going, the dad joke, alarm is ringing as well. But here's what Tom said. Tom said, I had a book called Reinventing Corporate Spirit, but a friend said, boring, call it If Aristotle Ran General Motors. We rarely get titles right at first. And I wonder, like, in your incredible career and now in your capacity as a teacher and as an author, how many times do you come across founders that are so wed and inflexible when it comes to everything from their name, their raison d'etre, but ultimately the story they're telling that refuses to evolve or change or transform?
Well, maybe I've been lucky, Joseph, but the vast majority of the people I work with are really open to thinking through this. I think most founders, they're not writers. They're not people who are sitting and writing the great American novel, or writing a screenplay. They're product people, they're engineers, they're people who see a problem in the world and they go out and they figure out, they're social people with social justice movements. They see a problem, they want to go change them. So when you come in and you start talking about a discipline that they know a lot about because they've seen movies before, they've read books, they've been to plays, they know what a story is. But when you say, your project is a story, let's think about it in that way, they're like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. And to me, the real epiphany for me as I started doing this thing is that people started to make connections. You could literally see the lights going on in their brains that they didn't make before, because they started to think about what they were doing as a story. There's someone who's struggling with something. They're having there's some inciting incident that kicks the story into gear. They're unable to achieve something they want to achieve. And then I can actually get them have a happy ending to this story by creating something new that makes it easier for them to do that. And the lights start to go on. So most of them have been incredibly receptive.
You mentioned the power of context. There's empathy and there's context, but we've also seen and this is not a new idea. In fact, it's a rather stale one. The idea that a startup founder would follow a formula or a template by going, meet David. David is a corporate executive. David is, and so what they do is they kind of try and bring the typical customer to life by then creating that little bit of context. And don't knock what you can't afford. It's not a terrible approach at all. It's an oversimplified one, but I think that's what's going on. It's the ability to say, let me tell you a story and help you understand it in context of one human. But I feel like maybe we're underestimating our audience.
Well, it's interesting. I always discourage people from starting their presentation with Meet David. I always suggest they start with a vision statement for how things are going to be different in the world when their product's out there, and then introduce David, but never say Meet David. Say, I was working with this person across town, who is their customer, by the way, or my best friend, or my sister, or I've had this experience myself, and then they just start going into the story. And they introduce the character in a much more organic way. I want to come back to something you said earlier, which I think is germane to this notion of how we kick off a talk and introduce the protagonist. And you talked about personal storytelling. Well, sometimes the founder is creating a product that's for themselves. Like they experienced something that didn't quite work. And then they were like, okay, I'm going to go off and create this. And I want to I want to have this solution. And if that's the case, they can tell sort of their origin story about how that realization led them to create the product or service they created, because they are the customer in the story. If they're not, it's okay to start with some sort of personal story. It's a great way to get into a story, but then you want to pivot pretty quickly to start talking about the person who you're building the product for. But it is so powerful to introduce either one of those approaches, because as you're talking about the power of a personal story, when you tell a story that you've experienced, you can't help but get more animated because it's your experience. So your eyes will start to glisten and sparkle a little bit. And because of the way humans interact with each other, as an audience, we feel that. I see the sparkle in your eyes. I see you getting a little more animated because you're telling me about something that you experienced. And then I start to feel it. And it's just an incredibly wonderful way to lead into a story if you can somehow put yourself in the story, even if it's just to get in and then turn the corner to talk about the customer.
I love that idea of the sparkle. And sometimes, it's even I was just thinking of that person was me. No, but the thing about even starting off with a let me tell you a story, immediately people are just like leaning in, or they're just like, okay.
So, Joe, I had this incredible experience. I do some coaching for some people. There's a program out in Berkeley where people come from all over the world, usually about 30 or 40 people, to take a training program to become better leaders. They're all in environmental leadership roles around the world. Helping save orangutans in Borneo, or saving the coastal waters in Madagascar. And I work with some of them to help them tell these stories about their experience. And I had this wonderful woman from Madagascar named Vola write this beautiful story. And she was practicing giving the speech because it was a speech that she was going to give. And she read it, and it sounded like someone had just handed her a piece of paper to read. So I said, Vola, I want you to imagine that you're just telling a story. And she said, what do you mean? She said, do you mean like as if my kids, I have 2 little boys, like they're sitting at my feet and I'm telling them a story? I said, yes, Vola, that's exactly what I want you to do. And the next time she read the speech, which she wrote, by the way, I was almost in tears.
Wow.
Because this thing had clicked in her head, and she's like, I'm not reading something, I'm telling a story. And just that little change in her own mind turned that speech into just her sharing a personal story about what brought her to this field. And it was just this brilliant moment. I'll never forget it. It's also in the book, but in fact, it's how I end the book, because I think that notion of reminding everybody, we all know how to do this. It's in our bones. It's in our DNA. We've evolved to be storytellers. If we can apply that learning in the context of getting something excited about something we've just created, it's going to go a much longer way in terms of bringing people on board and onto your side, which is why people need to tell these stories.
Well, I'm excited for your second book, which will be out soon enough, and it's called Let Me Tell You a Story. So look out for that whenever books are sold. But first, you need to buy this book as well. But the Let Me Tell You a Story. I want to go back to this idea of Yahoo and confusion. And I wonder how often founders make the mistake by saying the enemy is a company, the enemy is a person, the enemy is a product, instead of thinking bigger in terms of confusion or mediocrity or conformity or whatever the case may be. And I say that only in context of my story, and certainly my personal story is about a life and career pivot into a show about hope, positivity, and optimism, with a little curveball of open heart surgery just to make it a little spicy. But the word hope is an important word for me. This show is about hope, positivity, and optimism. And it is also we're about to get a 4-minute TED talk from double PhD and Professor Tom Morris. But let's hear what he has to say about hope, and then bring it back to the content and the context of startup stories and storytelling.
Hey, everybody. I don't know what Joseph was hoping I would talk about today, so I decided to talk about hope. As you know, we live in a time of great uncertainty along a lot of dimensions right now. And I see people getting discouraged, even come across people telling me they're a little hopeless about how to move forward in their lives or in their businesses. When's this pandemic going to end? When's politics going to change? What about the global climate crisis? Well, you know, hope is really important in life. It's properly not to be confused with a delusion or wishful thinking. Any healthy form of hope can act like a virtue or strength from the Latin virtu in our lives, like courage or honesty, a strength we can bring to our circumstances. Maybe it's something like a second order virtue. If you have good first order virtues like compassion and love and elevation of the spirit, hope can be like a virtue in that classic sense, but in even a stronger form, it can be what military folks call a force multiplier for your other strengths. So our first point is this: proper hope is a power, a personal strength to bring to any challenge or into circumstances of uncertainty. Now, we're not talking about irrational expectation or weak belief or any kind of self-deception. Virtuous hope isn't the result of any of this or any kind of weakness. It's aligned with that faith beyond sight that has guided the great explorers in the arts and sciences and philosophy throughout the centuries, as well as in business for a very long time. Proper hope is a cousin of realistic optimism, which can be learned and developed. I have in mind Martin Seligman's great book, Learned Optimism. So point 2, hope is akin to faith and optimism. Now recall for a second the story of Pandora, who was presented with a gift box she wasn't supposed to open. You know, what sense does that make? In the original Greek, though, the term is better translated as big jar, perhaps ornamental with a top that shouldn't be removed, just viewed and enjoyed. But Pandora had the quality of curiosity, another strength used properly. So she was not good at following instructions like many of us. She opened the jar, and as you know, most of the evils now in the world came flying out, dispersed everywhere. What an experience that must have been, much like the past year and a half for a lot of us. But the jar was not empty. Pandora's curiosity made her look again. There was one thing left at the bottom, something that stuck. You may remember that it was hope. She had this as what I think was the real gift to help her deal with everything else. One more quick point. In the book, If Aristotle Ran General Motors years ago, I suggested there are 2 keys to leadership greatness that we almost never find balanced in people's lives: humility and nobility. I mention this now because hope is one of those rare places where these 2 things meet. Yes, when you have proper hope, it's because you have the humility to admit you don't actually know how things are going to turn out. And you also have a nobility of mind to maintain an expectation and commitment for something good, in whatever form it may come. Hopelessness, by contrast, typically arises out of thinking we know more than we do. It's a result of intellectual arrogance. The biggest things that ever happen, as the book Black Swan taught us, we typically don't see coming. So we should hope for the best and work for the best. Point 3, hope is where humility and nobility meet. And I guess point 4, to be helpful, hope has to be remembered and used moving forward. By now you may hope I'm almost done, and I am. But one last and 5th point: hope best arises and grows strong in partnership with other people, not as a solitary matter. We give each other hope. And in particular, creative partnerships spark hope. They provide it with deep roots and healthy growth. You may have heard the story about the 2 college students who met and fell in love. She was in veterinary medicine, much like our beloved James Herriot on TV right now, and he was studying zoology to become a taxidermist. They got married and wanted to go into business together, oddly enough. So they hung out a sign with their newly shared name and a catchy slogan. It said, Roberts Veterinary and Taxidermy. Either way, you get your dog back. A creative partnership indeed, and a source of hope for us all. Stuffed as we are now with philosophical ideas, may we all go forth in hope. See you later.
Turns out he's a copywriter. Who knew?
Either way, you get your dog back.
Love that. And there is the hook, right?
Yeah. what was, as I listened to that, thinking about it through the lens of what we've been talking about, is like all innovators are hopeful by definition. They see something that they think is broken. They see someone struggling with something, or someone, and they think, well, I think there's a way I can help them through that. And they're hopeful. They believe it can be solved. Most other people haven't tackled it. Even if they think, well, maybe that could be fixed, they don't bother to try and fix it. But innovators are the hopeful ones. They're like, I believe there's a better way, and they go out and they try and make it happen. And I'm just trying to help them do it a little bit better and be a little more successful by figuring out what the story is and how to tell it.
By the way, Glenn says, hey, Tom Morris, and Bob says, brilliant contribution. Thanks, Tom Morris. So we spoke about confusion earlier, and there's that old saying that says, hope is not a strategy. Well, hope may not be a strategy, but can hope be a story?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There were so many different ways to tell stories. I was actually wanted to go back on something you talked about, other antagonists. Confusion is one. Not knowing is, you could argue, was the antagonist in Uber's story originally, right? If you're waiting for a ride somewhere and you just don't know if a cab's going to come, if it comes, is it going to be clean? Am I going to be able to pay for it? Is the driver going to be good? How long is it going to take to get? It's like all this is just not knowing, and Uber solved the not knowing problem. And every one of these things can be sort of surfaced and teased out if you really just understand what is the human behavior behind the story. And hope, coming back to hope is such a powerful human behavior. If you can somehow build that into your storytelling, you're well on your way, because this exercise is all about finding that thing that's just incredibly human and intensely human about what your protagonist is dealing with. If you can bring that into the story of your new thing, you're well on your way to writing a really good story.
It's an absolutely brilliant way for us to wind down, and we've still got a little bit more time, because I'm going to ask you one final question. But I love that Uber end cap, because it wasn't about the perfect information and supply meets demand. It was about anxiety. It was about certainty. It was about it's fantastic. It's fantastic. And that is a story that I will keep with me and take with me in many, many years to come. Already that will just resonate with me, because I tell the story of Uber, but I've never quite had that little addendum as well. So I'm going to call that a Riemer gem.
Thanks. It's all about finding that thing that's human about what your customer's struggling with. And yeah, there's the functional things. I need a ride. I need it to be on time. I need to know, and all those are the functional needs, and we need to know what those are. We need to build a product that addresses them. But if we understand what's behind that, the not knowing in this particular case, it just opens the door to building a better product. And of course, coming up with a great way of telling the story about someone who's standing on the side of a road and has a business meeting, and all this not knowing. And now we're building a specific story around that to really make that anxiety and the not knowing be something that your audience is going to really feel. And then you come in with your great solution, Uber, and it saves the day.
Well, David, we did not need any gimmicks, any bells or whistles to have a really memorable and just a powerful, a valuable conversation. But just so you know, I had a few tricks up my sleeve, which I call fun facts. And because this man, besides having run marketing for Yahoo and other interesting things, here's what you don't know about David Riemer. One is he is an absolute man that attracts the stars. He recorded his audiobook in the same studio where Beyonce recorded her first album. Of course, no one knew this until we posted it on Facebook a week ago. Here's another story as well, which is he had to be awakened at 3 a.m. in the morning to get in a car to go to the Hit Factory in LA to work on a Kodak commercial with Stevie Wonder. This one I am going to ask you, which is why 3 a.m.?
Stevie is in his world, he's creating 24/7, and the regular hours of the day don't mean anything to Stevie, which, by the way, makes it hard to get him to a shoot on time. He literally didn't show up for a whole day of a shoot. Imagine how much that cost to have all the crew there for a day that Stevie wasn't there. But he just works on his own rhythm, and wherever he is, he's got a setup. He's got his his keyboard, he's got his computer set up, so wherever he is, whether he's in his studio or whether he's on the stage or whether he's in his hotel room, he can create. And so if he's ready to create at 3 a.m, and he was ready at 3 a.m. to spend time with his agency way back in the 80s when we did that commercial, that's when you got in the car and you went to the Hit Factory to hang out with Stevie Wonder.
I love it. I love that story. And, you know, my God, I mean, we could talk about so many things. We could suddenly, in my mind, I was thinking, wait a second, what do we lose when we move from Kentucky Fried Chicken to KFC, right? What do we lose when we go from J. Walter Thompson to JWT? We lose so much when we pare that story down. But we won't discuss that now because we're out of time. We won't even discuss the fact that you look exactly like J.K. Simmons, in my opinion. As I told you, I had a bunch of little tricks up my sleeve, but I didn't need to go to them as well because this to me was just super, super special. The book is called Get Your Startup Story Straight. March right now to your local keyboard and get it on Amazon because it is something that is so needed and necessary amidst all this confusion, amidst all this clutter, amidst all of this noise, where people are really craving connections more so than just better, cheaper, faster. How's that for a story? The definitive storytelling framework for innovators and entrepreneurs. Mr. David Riemer, let's hope it's not another 10 years or so before we see each other again.
It was a real pleasure. I'm thrilled you had me on the show to talk about the new book, and I wish you all great success turning this really wonderful hour of marketing and other cultural kind of talk into something that's huge and may become a little bit famous.
Well, as I said, for me, the stretch goal is to be so incredibly not famous that, but you know, maybe I'll take a little bit every now and then. Just, you know, luckily for me, all of these people like Smokey Robinson, like CeeLo Green, these are all my personal friends, including the great Chuck Norris, who had this to say about you.
You are Chuck Norris approved.
And we will be back tomorrow with Michelle McCormack and some NFTs to give away. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching the show about hope, positivity, optimism, and if there's time left over, a little bit of marketing with your host, multiple author, and global keynote speaker, Joseph Jaffe. If you like the show, tell a friend or two. Please subscribe to the show. And if you want to get inside news, previews of upcoming guests, and much more, visit josephjaffe.com/subscribe to sign up for the show's newsletter.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.